Welcome to Socializing Security, where every week we have a discussion about security, compliance, and beyond.
Our goal is to learn and grow by socializing each week's topic with each other, our guests, and with you.
A quick compliance note, this podcast is meant for informational purposes only and should not be considered legal or regulatory advice.
We're glad you've joined us, and we hope you'll learn along with us.
And we're back for another episode of Socializing Security. Brian, how are you doing?
I'm doing well, Milou. How are you?
Good. I know this might date us a little bit, but we're in the phase where it's finally starting to get a little bit cooler here, so that's really pleasant and very necessary. But I think you're pretty busy with travel coming up and kind of you're all over the place, right?
Yeah, I'm coming into one of those, 3 trips in 5 weeks type situations. None of them are terribly exciting places to go, but 2 of the 3 places are new places, which is always fun for me. So it's about exploring and having new experiences, which is why I love travel. Yeah,
absolutely. Well, we're going to flip the script a little bit today because I think a lot of our episodes lately have been really focused on information security and cyber attacks. And while we love socializing those topics, we also want to make sure that we still shine a light on compliance and regulatory compliance, and might not be as sexy of a topic, I think, as security. I think compliance is generally, I've had people before be like, why do you work in compliance? It's like that, feeling. And I'm somebody who, I love the field, I love working in it, and I'm absolutely open to having conversations with, people that are interested in breaking into the compliance world, not just the security world. So thought we would kind of break it down and talk about really my viewpoint on how to build a successful compliance program and where that kind of comes from. And I'm happy to kind of shine a light on some of kind of recent experiences of how it started for a lot of the companies I've worked with, and then kind of how it goes from there, and maybe how I would do it differently if I could really step back and build it from the ground up.
Yeah, sometimes that's the best way to teach others, is to talk about what you've done and how you would have done it differently so that they don't fall in the same kind of potholes. But before we get into this, Milou, I would love to get your answer on why do you love compliance so much? Why is this something people should get excited about?
I like the question. I think for me, my background was very much I'm a lawyer by training, and knew very early on in law school that I didn't want to go a traditional path. I didn't see myself in a courtroom, and I just didn't necessarily see myself being a traditional lawyer. I was lucky to fall into an internship really early on in law school that was actually with the compliance department for a defense contractor, and that's where I really realized that the skill of understanding how to read regulatory text, which lawyers happen to be great at, and turn those into actionable practices for people across different skill sets, different backgrounds, and how the company could then evidence, building out something like a human trafficking program, and making sure that anybody on the line could identify signs of human trafficking and could report that to a compliance team. That wasn't just we have an anti-human trafficking policy, and it was really how do we build an effective program to actually empower people to do these things? And so that was really where it started for me. So it absolutely came out of my background, but I do love the cross-functional reality of the work that I do. Compliance interfaces with every single team, and I have to be approachable to everybody because I need to make sure that if something goes wrong, they feel like they can trust me and reach out to me and work with me. And so I think that's why I've enjoyed it so much. And again, it's just an area where you can have a lot of growth, even if you aren't a lawyer. If you're somebody who likes policies and likes actually building practical programs, you can really do some cool things with it.
Yeah, that sounds having worked together with you, I definitely see the excitement you had for going on a data center tour. That excites somebody like me because I've built a lot of them. I've seen a lot of different ones. Every chance I get, somebody says, hey, you want to come see the data center? I say, yeah. But, that's nerdy of me. You're not the nerdy type. So being able to explore all these different types of areas of business, if you will, I can get that. I get excited about that too. I've had roles that have drawn me away from the technology and into more business side of things, and solving problems, helping people in other spaces because of that unique perspective is kind of cool. So I totally get that and have seen that in you. So as far as compliance programs go, you've created some, I know, and I guess maybe let's just jump into that topic of, what have you found to be the most successful parts of creating it? Like, what are the things to focus on? And maybe give a little bit of that color of, I did it X, but I found out later that I should have gone Y, and this is why. Some of those learnings I think would be super helpful for everybody.
Yeah, happy to kind of dive into it. So I haven't inherited a couple of programs. I built programs from the ground up, which means I got to come in and a company was like, we need a compliance program, we don't have anything. And that's really great and fortunate, but a lot of companies do actually have something. Somebody within the organization was like, oh, we need this policy, and they started with something, and then just kind of it started accelerating from there. That's also how a lot of people got their jobs in compliance, is they were just there, and somebody was like, hey, we need somebody to do this, and then suddenly that was their job. And so I think in an ideal world, amazing if you get to build one from scratch, right? Because then you can really start to understand like what's driving the need for the compliance program. Is it really just the board has said like, hey, we don't have anything and we're concerned about our regulatory risk and we want you to build out a risk register and then build out regulatory requirements and start to actually shape policy and go from there? I have found that that's unlikely. A lot of the time, compliance is driven by customer demand. So especially in the startup space, a smaller company has started to go after some larger contracts, and those larger contracts just expect a different level or different standard of controls to be in place. And when I say controls, it means anything from like, do you have an information security policy, or are you conducting background checks on your employees? Do you sign contracts with employees? So it depends on the framework, but it's really just a set of rules. A control is just a rule from a standard and whatever the framework is. So a lot of the times, compliance comes out of customer demand. So the customer says, hey, I won't work with you until you have X, Y, and Z. And that's not the best place to start, because usually you are then on fire.
And a little late at that point.
Yeah, it means you didn't have the luxury of time, and now you're slapping something together to make sure that you're going to make your customer happy, and you're not going to lose the deal. Right? So I've seen a lot of companies, especially startups, this is very much the mindset that the customer is like, we won't work with you until you have a SOC 2 report, as an example, or we won't work with you until you have a certain statement, like a privacy notice on your website, or certain things that they look for, that their compliance department is like, hey, we just don't do business with companies that are immature, is what I would say. Like, it's not necessarily those companies, like, they might have actually been doing these things, they just don't have the maturity to have like an external audit yet, or they haven't had the funding for that yet. So I'd say the what is driving your compliance program is an important question to ask, because if it's customer driven, you can theoretically push back, because certain customers might be like, you have to have this particular standard. That standard might not make sense for the rest of your customers. So you might also be then willing to have the conversation of like, we see that you want this. What if we do this instead? Because it would actually help us achieve more goals across the board, instead of just, to get this one contract, we have to maintain this one audit. Again, if the customer is a big enough fish, you might say whatever, regardless of what they want, they're going to get what they want, right? And then you're just going to go and try your best to build out the program. But if you can build a more proactive program, I think it's easier to do, in the sense that you can you have the luxury of time.
Yeah. Yeah, I've definitely been in those situations where, you're trying to close a deal and the customer's like, you have to check this box and that box. And not having those checks to apply to those boxes can be tough. And, salespeople will be salespeople sometimes, and they will raise hell to get those things so that they can save that one deal. Do you find in those situations, you talked about being proactive is important, but do you see in the sales cycle, so in a much shorter cycle, like if I am working in a particular vertical and I know, hey, this one thing may pop up, would you advise me to pull you in earlier in that cycle to say, hey, Milou, come in here and start hearing what the customer wants, so that when they ask for this thing that I know we won't be able to give them, we could work around it, or we could have an offer ready to go?
Yeah, this is a really great recommendation, and something that I've encouraged other compliance professionals to do, is to engage early with the sales professionals and ask them pretty often what they're hearing, because they're going to have one of the best pulses on the market of what are their customers asking for. Even if they're like, oh, we know we don't have that, but wow, these 6 customers asked this over the last 3 months. That's actually a really great way to potentially get a budget approved ahead of time by your executive team. If you're like, hey, the sales team didn't pursue these particular opportunities because they knew that that was a requirement and we don't have that thing that they need. But if you can then show the sales team that you're willing to work with them and you really want to build out like, hey, we don't have this right now, but we think it's reasonable in 6 months, but we need budget approval from the executive team. Let's make sure we're super clear on what potential deals we could have had to potentially justify the cost. Because unfortunately, this stuff is like not cheap. When you're doing external assessments, they're really expensive. So you need to make sure that it's not just like, well, I decided that we want this report. It's, oh, we have this customer we missed out on it. We lost this opportunity because we couldn't play at that level.
Yeah, that sounds a lot like product management. Like I've had experience on that side of things, and those of you who may be bigger customers may have participated in some sort of advisory board or done some sort of interview with a product manager. Obviously, people on the other side know all about this. We, on the product side of things, it's constantly looking at what our customers asking for, talking to sales, saying, hey, what are the things you're hearing, not just the things that you're losing on. Ideally, we've got the data to tell what we've lost in, and that's a maturity level. You have to get to a certain size, a certain discipline to it, to be able to collect that as data, not just a bunch of anecdotes. And what you're saying about this from a compliance perspective sounds exactly like we do with the product side, which is, oh, we didn't have this one special feature and we've lost 3 deals and those 3 deals amounted to this percentage of our total revenue. It's time to build that feature. And I see the same thing as, oh, well, it's time to commit to doing FedRAMP and putting money behind a very expensive long-term process that we need to do because it's only going to become more common if we're in a certain industry or certain area.
Yeah, plus I think in my ideal world, right, sales, product, and compliance would all 3 be aligned, because ideally the roadmap for compliance should really mirror what product is working on too, to making sure that we're like, hey, we're going to need engineering resources to go do the things that we need to fix to get this thing. It's not just as easy as, oh, we're organizing an audit, we're going to pass. It's, oh, we have to go fix all the things we don't have. And that isn't just compliance documenting policy, right? Unfortunately, like, these things are larger lifts. For a lot of companies, getting the policies and procedures is not the hardest part of the audit. It's actually a lot of the actual technical implementations that take time and money away from the teams that are usually pretty strapped for time. So it's the backlog and prioritization of the items. If they are in lockstep with product, compliance, and the sales cycle, if those 3 things are all in line, then hopefully you can get engineering to also have buy-in and making sure that they have resources, or that they can get additional hands if they need it to actually be able to be like, okay, great, we want to do this, but we don't currently have the skill set or the time or resources in-house.
Yeah, it's, again, just like product management, it's balancing of resources and having as many perspectives as possible. So you've mentioned a few different compliance frameworks, and I know you haven't seen every single industry, but you've seen a few different ones. I guess, what are the most common ones that if I were starting into a compliance mode and saying, okay, we need to start getting some of these acetations or these check boxes, these badges, whatever term you want to use to track them. Like, what are some of the most common ones across industries, and maybe speak to maybe the security IT side of things, since that's probably going to be most of our listeners.
Yeah. So unfortunately, it's a moving target, right? I wish that we could say that there was just like one uniform framework that we've all decided to buy into, and I've decided like this is the best one, because it would make it easier for vendors to assess other vendors and customers to understand what we're doing, because the controls would look the same. Unfortunately, the way the market has gone is a lot of it is just dependent on region as well as dependent on price point. And a lot of these frameworks, they're making a lot of money. Audits are expensive, and even just sometimes getting access to a control sheet, which is truly just a fancy Excel spreadsheet with the rule statements that we've been talking about, is really expensive and cost prohibitive. So it really depends. I think a great place to start for companies, if they're trying to again, if they have the luxury of time and they want to build out like a gap assessment from like a standardized framework, I would probably recommend like the Center for Information Security and do like a CIS benchmark. That one's a relatively like globally recognized standard. I think another one that's also pretty recognizable across the industry on the information technology side would also be CSA STAR. And they do a really nice one because their assessment, you can self-assess, so it doesn't have to be an external audit. Their controls are free, and you can do like a level 1 assessment, which is really just going through all of the controls and saying, yes or no, we have this. And that can actually be a really helpful starting point to just do the exercise with their engineering team, to being like, hey, these are the things we do have, this is what we don't have, and you can kind of start from there.
Do you find that something like CSA STAR, where it is self-run, ends up being one of those things like do that first, because you'll have to go through cycles to be able to check all the boxes on there and be able to create it to a point where the customer will be like, okay, cool, I can trust you. Does that end up being a good predecessor for doing those things that will then require an external auditor?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great starting point because it's a pretty large framework and it's pretty globally recognized. What's nice about it too is like you can do externally assessed CSA STAR, so you can actually eventually graduate up to the level that you want to actually bring in an external auditor against those controls. I think that's honestly more common in the EU is where I've seen more companies have done it, as opposed to there's some other standards in the US that are more popular. What I would say is it's great because doing a CSA STAR self-assessment it could be the thing that you give your customers while you're actively undergoing another external audit. Because also, these things take time. So if you could do the internal assessment and let them know like, hey, we did this review internally and these are some of our gap areas, that might give your customers more information while you're telling them like, hey, we've committed to getting X, Y, or Z report and we expect it in 3 months. But in the meantime, we did this internal review. We're lined up with these controls. We've identified some of these as gaps. We think some of them will be covered in the audit we're doing, or starting to build out the timeline. I've seen a lot of customers are actually willing to work with companies that are pretty transparent about their gaps, instead of just saying, you don't have this thing, we're not going to work with you. It depends, right? Obviously, there's certain standards that, if they have to have state ramp or fed ramp, they're probably not going to work with you if you don't have it. But if you're a smaller startup and you're showing a commitment to compliance and you're on the way and you can show that, you have an engagement with an auditor and what the scope is, I've noticed that a lot of customers are actually willing to work with the companies, especially, if you have the technology that they want, then they're probably willing to wait.
Yeah. And I've seen like FedRAMP, which is one of the really big ones and very expensive to meet the standards, very expensive to do the audit, very, from what I've seen, pretty opaque on the whole assessment piece of it. Like you really don't know where you stand until it's done, and then you don't even know when it's going to come. So yeah, having multiple of these, obviously certain verticals you kind of have to have it. Like if you're going to do, high-end U.S. federal government, you're going to need FedRAMP. Most states you're going to need state ramp. And so really understanding your customer base today and where you want to go with your customer base in the future is super important. Again, sounds a lot like product management. You need to understand what features an enterprise is going to need versus an SMB, and make sure you've got them in place before you start trying to tackle those directly.
Good to know I have an alternative career path just in case if I need to pivot at some point. But
lots of parallels.
Yeah. What I would say too is, unfortunately, a lot of these frameworks, they're really localized. So it really depends what your customer base is. Again, I would absolutely make sure that you're really aware of what your customers want before you suddenly decide to tack on a new framework, to make sure that you're investing the resources in the right thing. Because in the US, SOC 2 is still king. And a SOC 2 Type 2 assessment is really still what most US companies require that aren't like more regulated in healthcare, finance, or government. In the US, we really decided that the AICPA's like baseline SOC 2 controls are king, which I always find is so interesting because it's managed by the AICPA, which is CPAs. So I've had some of the most challenging auditors doing SOC 2 audits because a lot of them, they're not technical, they're CPAs. So, they're super finance motivated, and the SOC 1 is way more financial. But a SOC 2 is only information technology controls. And I once had a CPA show up to do a physical security audit of a data center who had never been to a data center before.
Really highlighting the cross-disciplinary nature of compliance right there.
Yes, and passed that audit pretty easily because they were so amazed with the the controls that we had in place. I mean, data centers are really cool to go visit, but it was really like illuminating of also like making sure you're picking the right auditor, I think is another huge thing for companies that I think they underestimate, because ideally you're not only doing the audit to show your customers that you're doing what you're supposed to be doing. Ideally, you're also learning from your audits. So I actually don't think it's a bad thing if a company gets a finding in an audit. That usually means that there was actually probably something that needed to get fixed. And instead of just having a clean, shiny report, they actually took it on the chin and were like, oh, shoot, we weren't doing exactly what we were supposed to be doing, and we're going to learn from that and actually improve the program. I think that shows better continuous improvement of the entire program, because you are like, your team is not perfect. Someone's going to like drop off on some requirement. And so I actually usually don't bat an eye if there is a finding or two in a report. Usually it just kind of depends what it is, right? But ideally you're also not just picking the easiest audit firm. That's just something that that's a problem. And it's unfortunately like it's pretty rampant in the industry at the moment, specifically I think in the US side. There's a lot of like GRC, governance, risk, and compliance, like automation tooling that's coming out, which is great with the intention to like cut down the amount of screenshots and evidence collection team members have to do during an audit. But it also has kind of created this like secondary pipeline of those tools like to work with certain audit firms that plug into those tools. And some of them are super legit and very much meet the requirements of the standard. And others are very much there to pass the audit as quickly as possible. They're now saying like, oh, if you have this tool and you set everything up, you basically don't have to do a SOC 2 audit anymore.
Yeah, that sounds, again, parallels with security. Just because a company had a breach 2 years ago doesn't mean that they're unsafe, because eventually everybody's going to have a breach. The question really becomes, how do they react to it? What do they do to improve? What do they do to stop it from happening the next time? Is it fair to go to a company, and if you are looking at a company and you want to make sure that they're solid on their ISO 27001, can you ask for points in time to see how they have improved over time, to see, hey, what issues did you have 3 years ago and have you cleaned them up since then?
Unfortunately, most companies don't share the full value of their audit reports. They definitely don't. And again, that might be a little bit of a different conversation if you have a larger customer that, you might want to have like a one-on-one conversation with the compliance team about being like, hey, what are some of the weaknesses or things that you're improving? I think those are valid questions. I'm not sure how clear of a response you're going to get. I think what I would encourage companies to do is always look, if you're looking at the audit report, right? For ISO 27001, you actually don't usually get the audit report. You can ask for it, and I would recommend you do, because the certificate is normally like non-NDA. And it's showing like, hey, we did this thing, but it won't go into the depth of the audit. And so you can ask. Some companies won't give it to you though. So, and then decide to being like, okay, what else could you show beyond this ISO 27001? Ideally, right, they did the audit, they did it well. Maybe you can then ask to being like, hey, what were some of the findings, or what are the areas that your team is working on as a follow-up if they're like, we're not going to give you the audit report. I think that's a valid question. Again, what they will or will not give you might look like a security white paper.
Yeah.
But it is worth asking, because again, some teams might be like, oh my gosh, of course we'll give you that thing.
Yeah. And I'm assuming that most companies that you'd be drawing at this level would have some sort of plan around how to deal with a bad audit finding. So I assume that it's at the very least it's okay to ask. Well, the question I guess becomes, how likely are you to get an answer on the question of, how do you as a company deal with bad audit findings? How do you as a company go to fix these things? Is that a fair question to ask?
Yeah, I think so. What are the areas that you're either working on? What are like areas of improvement in the program? And again, I think maybe if you go about it not of like what went wrong, as opposed to like, hey, like in the spirit of continuous improvement, what are the processes your team is maturing, or what are the areas of the organization you're thinking about streamlining, fine-tuning, or are there any other audit framework standards your team is considering going after? I think most mature compliance organizations probably already have their sights set on the next thing that they're already getting ready for, whether that's because a customer started hinting at it or they're like, hey, we actually do have budget and time and resources to go after the thing. It's usually not just the one audit. And so I think if you ask about it, not really on like what went wrong or what were hard areas to pass, I think you'll be more effective in your vendor, like third-party vendor review. If you're like, hey, in the spirit of continuous improvement, we always like to ask, what is the company working on? I think I'd probably be pretty open about the areas of improvement, whether that's, we want to do better tabletop exercises for disaster recovery, or, we're really trying to make sure that all of our software vendors are tied into single sign-on to make it easier for us to do access reviews. I think those are pretty solid answers that most companies would be willing to give.
Cool. I guess kind of as we finish off here, we've talked a lot about kind of the early smaller companies, startups, companies that need to build a program. We've started kind of getting into the more mature aspect of things, but from a scalability perspective, again, in security, that's a big deal. How do we scale these programs to make sure that they will encompass a larger set of data, a larger set of users? Maybe how do you see compliance programs scale, and how do they better address some of these issues as they get bigger and have more resources, which theoretically means they've got a little bit more time on their hands?
Yeah, I think it depends on the company, right? Like I've noticed, like I've had issues where, if I've worked for an organization that suddenly acquired another organization that had like a whole other compliance program or all these people, it was really hard to like pull them into the same program. So I think making sure that whatever processes you're building are repeatable, not just for the 200 people that work for you, but also the 20,000 that could suddenly be onboarded, over the next year or two, of thinking through like, this makes sense right now, but it won't make sense in a year. It's probably not going to work long term. So thinking through like, let's not just check the box here, but actually build process that works longer term. Again, that comes with maturity. I would say too, eventually, like ideally as the program grows, like you'll bring on team members that are just dedicated in doing that one thing really, really well. They are just managing your privacy program, or they're just doing your SOC 2 audit. They're specialists for a specific audit or a framework. Is amazing. I haven't seen that. I've generally been the person that has to be like all of it, which is really fun and exciting, but also really draining. So, I've thought eventually I would love to work for a larger company where they have multiple team members doing like the one thing really, really well. I think that would be cool to see. But again, I think it's thinking through compliance shouldn't just be a cost center, and it should also be like something that helps with market differentiation and can also be part of the sales cycle and helping the teams grow. So what are the things that we're doing to making sure like, also compliance could be creating marketing content and actually like helping sell, in the sense that they're, you should absolutely be applauding your compliance leaders when they do pass an audit, and make sure there's a press release that goes out, because that's a big deal. And, I don't think we see enough of that, but I think celebrating the wins for the company across the teams help build that culture, help it make it easier for the compliance team to get buy-in across the board, so that they can grow with the company. Because what makes sense for 200 people won't make sense for 20,000.
Yeah, I keep drawing parallels, but they're there, and I think they help us all understand the two disciplines together, which is that security, you've got to make it fun. You got to celebrate the wins and not just mourn the losses, because when security or compliance just becomes about, oh, we missed this because we didn't have that compliance standard, or hey, we had this breach and now we're getting beat up on our stock price. It needs to be balanced out by, we stopped that threat. Congratulations, you all did a great job not clicking that link in that phishing program. You all have helped us to hit this new milestone that will open up, more regulated industries for us to be able to approach and get more customers out of. Those need to be celebrated. Those need to be shouted to the mountaintops. I've been lucky to work for a couple of companies that really did focus on a lot of diverse compliance standards and use those as part of the marketing. And I love showing that slide of like, if you don't find yourself on that screen, let's talk, because we've got all those and we may be looking for the next one. And I'd love to pass that along to my compliance team to say, hey, I talked to a customer today that's looking for X. Have you thought about going after that one? So there's tons of good stuff there for sure.
Yeah, I think the overall buy-in across the organization, obviously making sure that it's top down, is huge. to having a successful program, and then also making sure that it's growing with the organization. It's not just like we have this one thing and that's fine, because it's just not like, it's constantly changing. What customers ask for every 6 months is different. So making sure that your program is flexible enough that it can potentially grow with the company, and also sometimes static enough that it can just hold steady and just do the things that you're supposed to be doing really well while you're waiting until you can get the spend for the next thing.
Great. I think that's a great note to end on. Milou, I learned some stuff, so I'm going to consider this episode a success. And I hope everyone else enjoyed this conversation. Again, a little bit off the security topic. We definitely don't want to just focus on security because it doesn't live in a bubble. It's not isolated. And compliance is maybe not always the sexiest to everybody, but it is definitely an important aspect of it that we need to talk about. So appreciate your thoughts there, Milou. That was great.
Thanks. You know, I love this stuff, so I'm grateful to be in this space of compliance, but I know that it's not something that a lot of people understand, and so it's nice to just kind of like shine a light on what it looks like to potentially build a program from the ground up, or take on what you inherited and make it better.
Yep. That's what we're here to do, is to help everybody make these things better. So with that, I think we'll call this episode a close, and appreciate everybody's time and attention, and we look forward to socializing with you more in the future. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Socializing Security. We hope you learned a thing or two with us.
If you'd like to continue socializing with us on this topic or have feedback, we'd love to hear from you on LinkedIn or social media. Just search for Socializing Security. Or you can email us at info@socializingsecurity.com.
Until next time, stay social and stay secure.